Manifesto of the Communist Party by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. Against this specter, all the powers of old Europe have conspired in holy pack, the Pope and the Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, the French radicals and the German stowaways. There is not a single opposition party that is not branded as communist by its opponents in power, and not a single opposition party that does not hurl the stigmatizing accusation of communism in the face of its more advanced opponents, as well as its reactionary enemies. Two consequences follow from this fact. The first is that communism is now recognized as a power by all the European powers. The second is that it is time for the communists to express their ideas, their tendencies, and their aspirations in the light of day and before the whole world, thereby countering this myth of the communist specter with a manifesto for their party. To this end, representatives of the Communist Party of various countries have gathered in London and drawn up the following manifesto, which will appear in English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish. 1. Bourgeois and proletarians. The entire history of human society, up to the present day, is a history of class struggles. Freemen and slaves, patricians and plebeians, barons and serfs, masters and journeymen, in a word, oppressors and oppressed, always face to face, engaged in an uninterrupted struggle, sometimes covert, sometimes open. Struggle which leads at every stage either to the revolutionary transformation of the whole social system or to the extermination of both belligerent classes. In historical times, we find society divided almost everywhere into a series of estates, within each of which there reigns in turn a new social hierarchy of degrees and positions. In ancient Rome, they were the patricians, the equites, the plebeians, the slaves. In the Middle Ages, the feudal lords, the vassals, the masters and officers of the guilds, the serfs. And within each of these classes, we still find new nuances and gradations. Modern bourgeois society, which has arisen on the ruins of feudal society, has not abolished class antagonisms. What it has done is to create new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle, which have come to replace the old ones. However, our era, the era of the bourgeoisie, is characterized by the simplification of these class antagonisms. Today, the whole of society tends to split, more and more openly, into two great hostile camps, into two great antagonistic classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. From the serfs of the Middle Ages emerged the villains of the first cities, and these villains were the germ from which the first elements of the bourgeoisie sprang. The discovery of America and the circumnavigation of Africa opened up new horizons and gave new impetus to the bourgeoisie. The Chinese and East Indian markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and in merchandise in general gave commerce, navigation, and industry an unprecedented boost, thereby fueling the revolutionary element that lurked in the heart of a decomposing feudal society. The feudal or guild-based system of production, which still prevailed, was no longer sufficient to meet the needs of the new markets. Manufacturing took its place. The masters of the guilds were displaced by the industrial middle class, and the division of labor between the various corporations was supplanted by the division of labor within each workshop. But markets continued to expand, needs continued to grow. Manufacturing was no longer enough. The invention of steam and machinery revolutionized the industrial mode of production. Manufacturing gave way to modern large-scale industry, and the industrial middle class had to give way to industrial magnates, leaders of great industrial armies, to the modern bourgeoisie. Large-scale industry created the world market, already prepared by the discovery of America. The world market gave a gigantic boost to trade, navigation, and land communications. In turn, these advances were of considerable benefit to industry, and in the same proportion as industry, commerce, navigation, and railways expanded, the bourgeoisie developed, its capital grew, and it displaced and obliterated all the classes inherited from the Middle Ages. We see then that the modern bourgeoisie is, as were other classes in their time, the product of a long historical process, the fruit of a series of radical transformations in the system of exchange and production. Each stage of advancement taken by the bourgeoisie corresponds to a new stage of political progress. The oppressed class under the command of the feudal lords, the bourgeoisie forms in the commune an autonomous and armed association for the defense of its interests. In some places, it is organized into independent municipal republics. In others, it forms the third tributary estate of the monarchies. In the age of manufacture, it is the counterweight of the nobility within the feudal or absolute monarchy, and the foundation of the great monarchies in general. until finally, when large-scale industry is established and the channels of the world market were opened, political hegemony was achieved, and the modern representative state was created. Today, public power is, purely and simply, the board of directors that governs the collective interests of the bourgeois class. The bourgeoisie has played, throughout history, a truly revolutionary role. Wherever it was established, it overthrew all feudal, patriarchal, and idyllic institutions. It ruthlessly tore apart the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and left no bond standing except that of bare interest, of ready money, which has no guts. He threw the cold water of his selfish calculations over the holy fear of God, over mystical and pious devotion, over the chivalrous ardor and timid melancholy of the good bourgeois. He buried personal dignity under money and reduced all those innumerable, well-earned, written-down freedoms to a single freedom, the unlimited freedom of trade. He replaced, to put it bluntly, a regime of exploitation, veiled by the veils of political and religious illusions, with a frank, shameless, direct, and bare-bones regime of exploitation. The bourgeoisie stripped of its halo of sanctity everything that was previously considered venerable and worthy of pious events. It turned the doctor, the jurist, the poet, the priest, the scientist into its salaried servants. The bourgeoisie tore away the emotional and sentimental veils that enveloped the family and laid bare the economic reality of family relationships. The bourgeoisie came to demonstrate that those displays of brute force so admired by the reactionaries in the Middle Ages had their complete complement in the most indolent laziness. Until the bourgeoisie revealed this, we did not know how much the work of man could yield. The bourgeoisie has produced wonders far greater than the pyramids of Egypt, the Roman aqueducts, and the Gothic cathedrals. It has undertaken and completed enterprises far more grandiose than the migrations of peoples and the Crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, which is to say the entire system of production, and with it, the entire social system. This is the opposite of all the social classes that preceded it, which all had as their primary condition of life the inviolability of the existing system of production. The epoch of the bourgeoisie is distinguished from all other epochs by the constant and restless movement of production, by the uninterrupted upheaval of all social relations, by a ceaseless restlessness and dynamic. The unshakable and moldering relations of the past, with all their retinue of old and venerable ideas and beliefs, are breaking down, and the new ones are growing old before they can take root. Everything that was believed to be permanent and everlasting disappears, the sacred is profaned, and finally, man is forced, by the force of things, to contemplate his life and his relationships with others with a cold gaze. The need to find markets drives the bourgeoisie from one end of the planet to the other. It nests everywhere, builds everywhere, establishes relationships everywhere. The bourgeoisie, by exploiting the world market, gives the production and consumption of all countries a cosmopolitan stamp. Amid the complaints of the reactionaries, it destroys the national foundations of industry. The old national industries are collapsing, swept away by new ones, the establishment of which is a vital problem for all civilized nations, by industries which no longer process raw materials from within the country as they used to, but rather those brought from more distant climates and whose products find an outlet not only within the country's borders, but in all parts of the world. New needs are emerging which no longer satisfy the needs of the country as they once did, but which instead require the products of distant lands. The local and national market, which was self-sufficient and into which nothing came from outside, no longer reigns. Now the network of trade is universal, and all nations are involved in it, linked by ties of interdependence. And what happens with material production also happens with spiritual production. The spiritual products of the different nations come to form a common heritage. The limitations and peculiarities of the national character fade into the background, and local and national literatures all merge into a universal literature. The bourgeoisie, with the rapid development of all means of production, with the incredible facilities of its network of communications, brings civilization even to the most savage nations. The low price of its goods is the heavy artillery with which it knocks down all the walls of China, with which it forces the most unruly barbarian tribes to capitulate in their hatred of the foreigner. It forces all nations to adopt the bourgeois mode of production or perish. It forces them to establish within themselves the so-called civilization, that is, to become bourgeois. It creates a world made in its own image and likeness. The bourgeoisie subjugates the countryside to the rule of the town. It creates enormous cities, increases the urban population in a large proportion to the peasant population, and tears a considerable part of the country people from the cretinism of rural life. just as it subjugates the country to the town, it subjugates the barbarian and semi-barbarian peoples to civilized nations, the peasant peoples to bourgeois peoples, the East to the West. The bourgeoisie is increasingly uniting the means of production, property, and inhabitants of the country. It agglomerates the population, centralizes the means of production, and concentrates property in the hands of a few. This process had to lead by logical force to a regime of political centralization. Previously independent territories barely allied with different interests, different laws, autonomous governments, and their own customs lines are associated and merged into a single nation under one government, one law, one national class interest, and one single customs line. In the short century of its existence as a sovereign class, the bourgeoisie has created productive energies far greater and more colossal than all past generations put together. It is enough to think of the subjection of natural forces by the hand of man, of machinery, of the application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, of steam navigation, of railways, of the electric telegraph, of the clearing of entire continents, of rivers open to navigation, of new towns that sprang up from the earth as if by magic. Who, in past centuries, could even suspect that in the bosom of society, fertilized by the work of man had so many energies and elements of production buried underground? We have seen that the means of production and transport on which the bourgeoisie developed sprang up within feudal society. When these means of transport and production reached a certain stage of their development, it turned out that the conditions under which feudal society produced and traded, the feudal organization of agriculture and manufactures, in a word, the feudal system of property, no longer corresponded to the progressive state of the productive forces. They hampered production instead of promoting it. They had become so many obstacles to its development. It was necessary to make them jump, and they jumped. Free competition came to take its place, with the political and social constitution appropriate to it, in which the economic and political hegemony of the bourgeois class was already revealed. Well, a similar spectacle is taking place before our eyes today. The conditions of production and exchange of the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois system of property, modern bourgeois society, which has been able to conjure up such fabulous means of production and transport, remind us of the sorcerer who was powerless to control the subterranean spirits he had conjured up. For several decades now, the history of industry and trade has been nothing but the history of modern productive forces rebelling against the existing mode of production, against the system of property, which is the basis of the conditions of life and political domination of the bourgeoisie. It is enough to mention the commercial crises, the periodic recurrence of which poses an ever-increasing danger to the existence of bourgeois society as a whole. Commercial crises, besides destroying a large part of manufactured products, destroy a considerable part of existing productive forces. In such crises, a social epidemic breaks out which in any previous era would have seemed absurd and inconceivable: the epidemic of overproduction. Society is suddenly thrown back into a state of momentary barbarism. It seems that a plague of famine or a great war of destruction has left it depleted, without resources to survive. Industry and trade are on the verge of perishing. And why? Because society has too much civilization, too many resources, too much industry, too much trade. The productive forces at its disposal are no longer sufficient to promote the bourgeois system of property. They are already too powerful to serve this system, which hinders its development. And as soon as they overcome this obstacle, they sow disorder in bourgeois society and threaten to overthrow the bourgeois system of property. Bourgeois social conditions are already too narrow to encompass the wealth they engender. How does the bourgeoisie overcome crises? In two ways: by violently destroying a large mass of productive forces and conquering new markets, while at the same time trying to exploit the old markets more conscientiously. In other words, it remedies one crisis by preparing other, more extensive and impressive ones, and by mutilating the means at its disposal to prevent them. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie overthrew feudalism are now turned against it. And the bourgeoisie not only forges the weapons that will kill it, but also raises up the men who are called upon to wield them. These men are the workers, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, that is capital, develops, so does the proletariat develop, that modern working class which can live only by finding work, and which finds work only in proportion as it feeds capital. The worker, forced to sell himself piecemeal, is a commodity like any other, and is therefore subject to all the changes and modes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. The expansion of machinery and the division of labor in the present proletarian system deprive the latter of all its autonomy, all its free initiative, and all its charm for the worker. The worker becomes a mere cog in the machine, from whom only mechanical, monotonous, and easily learned operations are required. The costs incurred by a worker are therefore reduced, more or less, to the minimum of what he needs for living and for perpetuating his race. And it is well known that the price of a commodity, and labor as one of many, is equal to its cost of production. The more distasteful the labor, the more the wages paid to the laborer decrease. Moreover, the more machinery and the division of labor increase. The more labor increases, either because the working day is lengthened or because the required output is increased, the speed of the machinery is quickened, etc. Modern industry has transformed the small workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the capitalist magnate. The working masses concentrated in the factory are subjected to military organization and discipline. The workers, the rank and file of industry, work under the command of a whole hierarchy of sergeants, officers, and chiefs. They are not only servants of the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois state, but are daily and hourly under the enslaving yoke of the machine, of the foreman, and above all of the bourgeois industrialist who owns the factory. And this despotism is all the more mean-spirited, all the more execrable, all the more outrageous, the more openly it proclaims that it has no other aim than profit. The less skill and strength are required for manual labor, that is, the more developed is modern industry, the more the labor of women and children displaces that of men. Socially, the differences of age and sex no longer apply to the working class. They are all men, women, and children, mere instruments of labor, between which there is no difference except that of cost. When the exploitation of the worker by the manufacturer has borne fruit, and the former receives his wages, the other representatives of the bourgeoisie fall upon him: the landlord, the shopkeeper, the moneylender, etc. A whole series of modest elements who had belonged to the middle class, small industrialists, merchants and rentiers, artisans and farmers, are absorbed by the proletariat. Some because their small wealth is not sufficient to meet the demands of large-scale industry, and they succumb to the competition of the strongest capitals, and others because their abilities are buried under the new advances in production. All social classes, therefore, contribute to swell the ranks of the proletariat. The proletariat goes through various stages before becoming fortified and consolidated. But its struggle against the bourgeoisie dates back to the very moment of its existence. At first they are isolated workers, then those in a factory, then those in an entire branch of work who confront in a locality the bourgeois who personally exploits them. Their attacks are not only directed against the bourgeois mode of production, but also against the instruments of production themselves. The workers, in revolt, destroy other people's goods that compete with them, smash machines, set fire to factories, and strive to return to the now-dead status of the medieval worker. At this first stage, the workers form a mass scattered throughout the country and disunited by the competition. The mass gatherings of workers are not yet the result of their own unity, but the result of the unity of the bourgeoisie, which in order to achieve its own political ends must mobilize, and still does, the entire proletariat. At this stage, the proletarians are fighting not against their enemies, but against the enemies of their enemies, against the vestiges of the absolute monarchy, the great landowners, the non-industrial bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie. The march of history is all concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie, and every victory thus achieved is a victory of the bourgeois class. However, the development of industry not only swells the ranks of the proletariat, but also concentrates them. Their forces grow, and so does the consciousness of them. And as machinery obliterates the differences and categories in work and reduces wages almost everywhere to a uniform and very low level, so too do the interests and conditions of life within the proletariat become more leveled. The ever more acute competition between the bourgeoisie and the commercial crises which it unleashes make the wages of the worker more and more insecure. The incessant and ever more rapid progress of machinery gradually increases the insecurity of his existence. The collisions between workers and individual bourgeois are increasingly assuming the character of collisions between two classes. The workers began to form coalitions against the bourgeoisie. They formed associations and united to defend their wages. They created permanent organizations to equip themselves for possible battles. From time to time, revolts and uprisings broke out. The workers have achieved some victories, but these are always temporary. The real aim of these struggles is not to achieve an immediate result, but to extend and consolidate workers' unity. This is helped by the increasingly easy means of communication created by large-scale industry, which serve to bring workers from different regions and localities into contact with each other. Through this contact, the many local actions, which everywhere have the same character, become a national movement, a class struggle. And every class struggle is a political action. The towns of the Middle Ages, with their country roads, needed whole centuries to unite with each other. The modern proletariat, thanks to the railways, has created its union in a few years. This organization of the proletarians as a class, which is to say as a political party, is undermined at every moment by the unbridled competition among the workers themselves. But it always advances and triumphs, in spite of everything, ever stronger, ever firmer, ever more vigorous. Taking advantage of the discords that arise within the bourgeoisie, it imposes the legal sanction of its own interests. Thus, the law of the 10-hour day was born in England. The collisions between the forces of the old society give new impulses to the proletariat. The bourgeoisie fights incessantly, first against the aristocracy, then against those sections of the bourgeoisie whose interests conflict with the progress of industry, and always against the bourgeoisie of other countries. In order to fight these battles, it has no choice but to appeal to the proletariat, to call upon its aid, and thus draw it into the political arena. And thus it supplies it with elements of strength, that is, weapons against itself. Moreover, as we have seen, the progress of industry brings into the ranks of the proletariat a whole series of elements of the ruling class, or at least places them on the same terms of life. And these elements supply the proletariat with new forces. Finally, in those periods when the class struggle is on the point of being decided, the process of disintegration of the ruling class latent within the old society is so violent and so clear that a small part of that class breaks away from it and embraces the revolutionary cause, passing over to the class which holds the future in its hands. And just as before a part of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, now a part of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat. The bourgeois intellectuals who, by theoretically analyzing the course of history, have succeeded in seeing its course clearly, break the march in this transition. Of all the classes which confront the bourgeoisie today, there is only one that is truly revolutionary: the proletariat. The others perish and disappear with large-scale industry. The proletariat, on the other hand, is its genuine and peculiar product. The elements of the middle classes, the small industrialist, the small trader, the artisan, the peasant, all fight against the bourgeoisie to save their existence as such classes from ruin. They are not, therefore, revolutionaries, but conservatives. What is more, they are reactionaries, since they want to turn back the wheel of history. All that is revolutionary about them is their imminent transition to the proletariat. With this attitude, they do not defend their present interests, but their future ones. They give up their own position to embrace that of the proletariat. The ragged proletariat, that passive putrefaction of the lowest strata of the old society, will be partly drawn into the movement by a proletarian revolution, although the whole conditions of its life make it more prone to be bought as an instrument of reactionary manipulation. The conditions of life of the old society are already being destroyed in the conditions of life of the proletariat. The proletarian has no property. His relations to wife and children have nothing more in common with bourgeois family relations, modern industrial production, the modern yoke of capital, which is the same in England as in France, in Germany as in America, obliterates all national character in him. Laws, morality, religion are for him so many bourgeois prejudices behind which lurk so many bourgeois interests. All the classes that preceded him and conquered power sought to consolidate the positions they had acquired by subjecting the whole of society to his system of acquisition. The proletarians can only conquer the social forces of production by abolishing the system of acquisitiveness to which they are subject, and with it, the entire system of appropriation of society. The proletarians have nothing of their own to secure, but they must destroy all the private security and assurance of others. Hitherto, all social movements have been movements unleashed by a minority or in the interests of a minority. The proletarian movement is the autonomous movement of an immense majority in the interests of an immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest and most oppressed stratum of present-day society, cannot rise up and rise again without shattering the entire edifice of official society from its foundations to its very top. In form, though not in content, the campaign of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie begins as a national one. It is logical that the proletariat of each country first of all settles accounts with its own bourgeoisie. In outlining in very general terms the different stages of development of the proletariat, we have followed the events of the more or less hidden civil war that is taking place within existing society up to the moment when this civil war unleashes an open and frank revolution, and the proletariat, by violently overthrowing the bourgeoisie, lays the foundations of its power. Hitherto, every society has rested, as we have seen, on the antagonism between the oppressed and the oppressing classes. But in order to oppress a class, it is necessary to secure at least the indispensable conditions of life for it. Otherwise, it would wither away, and with it, its enslavement. The serf was elevated to the rank of a member of the community without ever leaving serfdom, just as the peasant was transformed into a bourgeois under the yoke of feudal absolutism. The situation of the modern worker is very different. Far from improving as industry progresses, it declines and worsens below the level of his own class. The worker becomes impoverished, and pauperism develops in proportions far greater than the population and wealth. This is a clear proof of the inability of the bourgeoisie to continue to govern society and to impose on it the conditions of its life as a class. It is incapable of governing because it is incapable of guaranteeing its slaves an existence even within their slavery, because it is forced to let them get to a state of helplessness in which it has no choice but to support them when it is they who should support it. Society can no longer live under the rule of this class. The life of the bourgeoisie has become incompatible with society. The existence and dominance of the bourgeois class is essentially determined by the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few individuals, the formation and constant increase of capital, and this, in turn, cannot exist without wage labor. Wage labor inevitably presupposes competition among workers. The progress of industry, which is automatically and spontaneously channeled by the bourgeoisie, forces the workers to unite in a revolutionary way through organization instead of isolating them through competition. Thus, as large-scale industry develops, the bourgeoisie sees the foundations on which it produces and appropriates its products shaken beneath its feet. And as it advances, it digs its own grave and raises its own gravediggers. Its death and the triumph of the proletariat are equally inevitable. 2. Proletarians and communists. What is the relationship between communists and proletarians in general? Communists do not form a party separate from other workers' parties. They have no interests of their own that are distinct from the general interests of the proletariat. They profess no special principles by which they aspire to shape the proletarian movement. The communists differ from other proletarian parties only in this, that in each and every national proletarian action, they always emphasize and assert the common and peculiar interests of the entire proletariat, independent of its nationality. And that, whatever the historical stage in which the struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie moves, they always maintain the interest of the movement as a whole. The communists are, therefore, practically the most determined part, the ever-present spur of all the workers' parties in the world. Theoretically, they have an advantage over the great masses of the proletariat in their clear vision of the conditions, the paths, and the general results to which the proletarian movement must lead. The immediate objective of the communists is identical to that pursued by other proletarian parties in general: to form the class consciousness of the proletariat, to overthrow the regime of the bourgeoisie, to lead the proletariat to the conquest of power. The theoretical propositions of the communists are not at all based on ideas or principles forged or discovered by any redeemer of mankind. They are all a generalized expression of the material conditions of a real and living class struggle, of a historical movement which is developing before everyone's eyes. Nor is the abolition of the existing system of property a peculiar characteristic of communism. The conditions that form the property regime have always been subject to historical changes, to constant historical alterations. Thus, for example, the French Revolution abolished feudal property to establish bourgeois property on its ruins. What characterizes communism is not the abolition of property in general, but the abolition of the property regime of the bourgeoisie, of this modern institution of bourgeois private property, the ultimate and most complete expression of that system of production and appropriation of what is produced, which rests on the antagonism of two classes, on the exploitation of some men by others. Understood in this way, communists can summarize their theory in this formula: abolition of private property. We are accused of wanting to destroy personal property, the fruit of human work and effort, that property which is for man the basis of all freedom, the incentive to all activities, and the guarantee of all independence. Well-acquired property, the fruit of human labor and effort. Are you referring to the property of the humble artisan, of the small farmer, the historical precedent of bourgeois property? No, we do not need to destroy that. The development of industry has already done so and is doing so all the time. Or do you mean the modern private property of the bourgeoisie? Tell us, does wage labor, the labor of the proletariat, yield property? No, far from it. What yields property is capital, that form of property which thrives on the exploitation of wage labor, which can only grow and multiply on condition that it generates new wage labor in order to make it also the object of its exploitation. Property, in its present form, does not allow of any way out of this antagonism between capital and wage labor. Let us pause for a moment to consider the two terms of the antithesis. To be a capitalist is to occupy a position, not merely personal but social, in the process of production. Capital is a collective product and can only be put into operation by the cooperation of many individuals. And one could even say that, strictly speaking, this cooperation encompasses the common activity of all individuals in society. Capital is therefore not a personal asset, but a social power. Those of us who aspire to convert capital into collective property, common to all members of society, do not aspire to convert personal wealth into collective property. All we aspire to is to transform the collective character of property, to strip it of its class character. Let us now speak of wage labor. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, that is, the sum of provisions necessary to support the worker as such. Everything that the wage laborer acquires by his labor is, therefore, what he strictly needs to continue living and working. We do not in any way aspire to destroy the system of personal appropriation of the products of work aimed at creating means of subsistence, a system of appropriation which, as we see, does not leave the slightest margin of net profit, and with it, the possibility of exercising influence over other men. What we aspire to is to destroy the disgraceful character of this system of appropriation, in which the worker lives only to multiply capital, in which he lives only to the extent that the interests of the ruling class advise him to live. In bourgeois society, man's living labor is only a means of increasing accumulated labor. In communist society, on the contrary, accumulated labor will be a mere means of extending, promoting, and enriching the life of the worker. In bourgeois society, the past rules over the present. In communist society, the present rules over the past. In bourgeois society, all personality and initiative are reserved for capital. The individual worker has neither initiative nor personality. And the abolition of these conditions is what the bourgeoisie calls the abolition of personality and liberty. And yet, it is right. We do indeed aspire to see the abolition of personality, independence, and bourgeois liberty. Within the bourgeois system of production, freedom is understood as free trade, the freedom to buy and sell. With the disappearance of traffic, free traffic will necessarily disappear as well. The apology for free traffic, like all the praises of freedom in general which our bourgeoisie sings, only have meaning and reason for being insofar as they signify the emancipation from the shackles and servitude of the Middle Ages, but they pale in comparison with the communist abolition of traffic, of the bourgeois conditions of production, and of the bourgeoisie itself. You are terrified that we want to abolish private property, as if in your present society private property were not already abolished for 9/10 of the population. as if it did not exist precisely at the cost of not existing for those 9/10. What then do you really reproach us for? Wanting to destroy a system of property which has as its necessary condition the dispossession of the immense majority of society. You reproach us, to put it bluntly, for wanting to abolish your property. Yes, that is what we aspire to. For you, from the moment when labor can no longer be converted into capital, into money, into rent, into a monopolizable social power, from the moment when personal property can no longer be exchanged for bourgeois property, the person does not exist. With this, you confess that for you there is no other person than the bourgeois, the capitalist. Well, it is the personality thus conceived that we aspire to destroy. Communism does not deprive anyone of the power to appropriate social products. It only does not allow the power to usurp another's labor by means of this appropriation. It is argued that once private property is abolished, all activity will cease and universal indolence will reign. If this were true, a society like the bourgeois one, in which those who work do not acquire, and those who acquire do not work, would have long since crashed against the rock of idleness. Your objection boils down, after all, to a truth which needs no demonstration, and that is that, with the disappearance of capital, wage labor will also disappear. The objections raised against the communist regime of material appropriation and production are extended to the production and appropriation of spiritual products. Just as the destruction of class property is, for the bourgeois, synonymous with the destruction of production, so the destruction of class culture is synonymous with the destruction of culture in general. This culture, whose loss is so deplored, is the one that turns the vast majority of society into a machine. When you argue with us and criticize the abolition of bourgeois property on the basis of your bourgeois ideas of freedom, culture, law, etc., you do not realize that these very ideas are products of the bourgeois system of property and production, just as your law is nothing but the will of your class raised to law, a will which has its content and embodiment in the material conditions of life of your class. You share with all the ruling classes that have ever existed and perished the self-serving idea that your system of production and property, which is the result of historical conditions which disappear in the course of production, is based on eternal natural laws and the dictates of reason. You understand the perishing of ancient property. You understand the perishing of feudal property. What you cannot understand is the perishing of bourgeois property, your property. Abolition of the family. When we hear of these satanic intentions of the communists, even the most radical people cry out in outrage. Let us see. What is the present-day family, the bourgeois family, based? On capital, on private profit. Only the bourgeoisie has a family in the full sense of the word. And this family finds its complement in the forced absence of family relations among the proletarians and in public prostitution. It is natural that this type of bourgeois family disappears when its complement disappears, and that both cease to exist when the capital that serves as its basis ceases to exist. Do you reproach us for aspiring to abolish the exploitation of children by their parents? Yes, it is true. That is what we aspire to. But it is, you say, that we intend to destroy the intimacy of the family, replacing domestic education with social education. Is not your own education also influenced by society, by the social conditions in which it develops, by the more or less direct interference of society through the school, etc.? It is not precisely the communists who invent this interference of society in education. What they do is modify its present character and remove education from the influence of the ruling class. These bourgeois clichés about family and education, about the intimacy of relations between parents and children, become all the more grotesque and shameless the more big industry tears apart the family ties of the proletarians and turns children into simple commodities and mere instruments of labor. But you communists, the entire bourgeoisie shouts in chorus, want to collectivize women. The bourgeois, who sees in his wife only a simple instrument of production, when he hears us proclaim the need for the instruments of production to be exploited collectively, cannot help but think that the collective regime will also be extended to women. Does not realize that what is at stake is precisely to end the situation of women as mere instruments of production. Nothing could be more ridiculous, on the other hand, than the high-minded indignation of our bourgeoisie when they speak of the much-vaunted collectivization of women by communism. No, the communists do not have to bother to introduce what has always, or almost always existed in society. Our bourgeois, apparently not content with having the wives and children of their proletarians at their disposal. Let's not even talk about official prostitution. Take great delight in seducing each other's wives. In reality, bourgeois marriage is already a community of wives. At most, the communists could be reproached for wanting to replace this hypocritical and modest collective system of today by an official, frank, and open collectivization of women. Moreover, it is easy to understand that, with the abolition of the present mode of production, the system of community of women who give birth and who take refuge in prostitution, both official and covert, will disappear with it. We communists are also accused of wanting to abolish the homeland and nationality. The workers have no homeland. It is difficult to take away from them what they do not have. However, since the proletariat's immediate goal is the conquest of political power, its elevation to a national class, to a nation, it is evident that it also has a national sense, although this sense does not coincide in any way with that of the bourgeoisie. The very development of the bourgeoisie, free trade, the world market, the prevailing uniformity of industrial production, and the living conditions it engenders, are responsible for erasing more and more national differences and antagonisms. The triumph of the proletariat will finally make them disappear. The joint action of the proletarians, at least in civilized nations, is one of the primary conditions for their emancipation. To the extent that the exploitation of individuals by others disappears, the exploitation of nations by others will also disappear. With the antagonism of classes within each nation, the hostility of nations towards each other will be erased. We do not want to go into an analysis of the accusations made against communism from a religious, philosophical, and ideological point of view in general. It does not take a genius to see that as the conditions of life, social relations, and social existence of man change, so do his ideas, opinions, and concepts. In a word, his consciousness. The history of ideas is a clear proof of how spiritual production changes and transforms itself with material production. The ideas that prevail in an era have always been the ideas of the ruling class. There is talk of ideas that revolutionize an entire society. In doing so, one merely gives expression to a fact, and that is that within the old society, the elements for the new have already germinated, and at the same time as the old conditions of life fade away or collapse, the old ideas also collapse and fade away. When the ancient world was on the verge of disappearing, the ancient religions were defeated and supplanted by Christianity. In the 18th century, when Christian ideas were succumbing to rationalism, feudal society was desperately struggling, making a last effort with the then revolutionary bourgeoisie. The ideas of freedom of conscience and religious freedom only proclaim the triumph of free competition in the ideological world. We will be told that religious, moral, philosophical, political, legal, etc. ideas, although they undergo changes throughout history, always have a foundation of permanence, and that beneath these changes there has always been a religion, a morality, a philosophy, a politics, a law. Furthermore, it will be argued, there are eternal truths, such as liberty, justice, etc., common to all societies and to all stages of social progress. Communism, the argument goes, is intended to destroy these eternal truths, morality, and religion, and not to replace them with new ones. It is intended to violently interrupt all previous historical development. Let us see what this accusation amounts to. Until now, the entire history of society has been a constant succession of class antagonisms, which take on various forms according to the times. But whatever form it may take in each case, the exploitation of one part of society by another is a fact common to all past epochs. It is not surprising, therefore, that the social consciousness of all epochs should adhere, in spite of all the variety and all the divergences, to certain common forms of consciousness, until the class antagonism which informs them has radically disappeared. The communist revolution is breaking with the traditional system of property in the most radical way. It is therefore not surprising that, in its development, it is forced to break with traditional ideas in the most radical way. But we do not wish to dwell any longer on the reproaches of the bourgeoisie against communism. We've already said that the first step of the workers' revolution will be the raising of the proletariat to power, the conquest of democracy. The proletariat will use power to gradually strip the bourgeoisie of all capital and all instruments of production, centralizing them in the hands of the state, that is, of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and seeking to promote productive energies by all means and as quickly as possible. Of course, at first this can only be achieved by despotic action on property in the bourgeois mode of production, by means of measures which, although they may seem economically insufficient and unsustainable at the moment, will be a great driving force in the course of the movement, and which cannot be dispensed with as a means of transforming the entire existing mode of production. These measures will not, of course, be the same in all countries. For the most progressive countries, we will mention a few, which can no doubt be applied on a more or less general basis, depending on the case. 1. Abolition of private property. The state will own all property and use the profits from the land for its expenses. 2. Imposition of heavy income taxes. 3. Elimination of the right of inheritance. No person may inherit the property of his or her family. 4. The state will keep the property of all those who are against the government and those who leave the country. 5. Prohibition of private banks. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state through a national bank with state capital. 6. Centralization of transport in the hands of the state. 7. Increase in the number of state-run factories. 8. All citizens will be required to work. 9. Erase the differences between the countryside and the city. 10. Provide free public education to all children. Ban child labor in factories. As soon as class distinctions have disappeared in the course of time and all production is concentrated in the hands of society, the state loses all political character. Political power is, strictly speaking, nothing more than the organized power of one class for the oppression of another. The proletariat is forced to organize itself as a class in order to fight the bourgeoisie. The revolution brings it to power. But as soon as it, as the ruling class, forcibly overthrows the existing mode of production, it will thereby overthrow the conditions determining class antagonism, the classes themselves, and thus its own sovereignty as a class. And the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, will be replaced by an association in which the free development of each determines the free development of all. 3. Socialist and communist literature. 1. Reactionary socialism. A feudal socialism. The French and English aristocracy, unwilling to give up their historical position, took to writing libels against modern bourgeois society when they could do nothing else. In the French Revolution of July 1830, they were again defeated by the hated intruder in the English reform movement. No longer able to wage a serious political battle, they had no other weapon than the pen. But in the literary arena, too, times had changed. It was no longer possible to continue using the language of the Restoration period. In order to gain sympathy, the aristocracy had to apparently forget its own interests and accuse the bourgeoisie, without having in mind any other interest than that of the exploited working class. In this way, they had the pleasure of provoking their opponent and victor with threats and whispering more or less catastrophic prophecies in his ear. Thus was born feudal socialism, a mixture of lament, echo of the past, and dull murmur of the future. A socialism that from time to time dealt the bourgeoisie a blow in the heart with its sardonic and sharp judgments, but that almost always provoked laughter because of its total inability to understand the course of modern history. In order to attract the people to him, he waved the sack of the proletarian beggar as a flag. But whenever he followed him, the people saw the old feudal arms flashing on the backs of the leaders and dispersed with an uncontained and rather disrespectful laugh. A section of French legitimists and Young England were the most perfect organizers of this spectacle. These feudal lords, who insist so much on proving that their methods of exploitation were in no way similar to those of the bourgeoisie, forget one thing, and that is that the circumstances and conditions under which they carried out their exploitation have disappeared. And while boasting that under their regime, the modern proletariat did not exist, they do not realize that this modern bourgeoisie, which they so abhor, is a historically necessary product of their social order. Moreover, they do not bother to conceal the reactionary stamp of their doctrines, and this explains why their most furious accusation against the bourgeoisie is precisely that it has created and fostered under its regime a class that is destined to destroy the entire inherited social order. What the bourgeoisie is most reproached for is not creating a proletariat, but creating a revolutionary proletariat. In practice, therefore, they are always ready to take part in all forms of violence and repression against the working class. And in prosaic reality, despite all the pompous rhetoric, they resign themselves to collecting the golden eggs and exchanging nobility, love, and chivalrous honor for the vile traffic in wool, sugar beets, and brandy. Since priests always walk arm in arm with feudal lords, it is not surprising that this feudal socialism comes together with clerical socialism. Nothing is easier than to give Christian asceticism a socialist veneer. Did not Christianity also fight against private property, against marriage, against the state? Did it not preach charity and almsgiving, celibacy and the punishment of the flesh, monastic life and the church in opposition to institutions? Christian socialism is the swab with which the clergyman blesses the aristocrat's spite. Be petty bourgeois socialism. The feudal aristocracy is not the only class overthrown by the bourgeoisie, the only class whose conditions of life modern bourgeois society has come to oppress and kill. Medieval peasants and small farmers were the precursors of the modern bourgeoisie. And in countries where industry and trade have not reached a sufficient level of development, this class continues to vegetate alongside the rising bourgeoisie. In those other countries where modern civilization has attained a certain degree of progress, a new petty bourgeois class has arisen, which hovers between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and which, although it constantly revolves around bourgeois society as its satellite, only furnishes the proletariat with new elements precipitated upon it by competition. With the development of large-scale industry, a moment comes when this section of modern society loses its substantive character and is supplanted in trade, manufacture, and agriculture by overseers and servants. In countries like France, where the working class represents much more than half of the population, it was natural that certain writers, espousing the cause of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, should take as their standard, in order to criticize the bourgeois regime, the interests of the petty bourgeoisie and the peasants, sympathizing with the working class cause and the ideals of the petty bourgeoisie. Thus was born petty bourgeois socialism. Its most prominent representative, both in France and in England, is Sismondi. This socialism has analyzed with great insight the contradictions of the modern mode of production. It has exposed the hypocritical subterfuges with which economists try to justify them. It has brought to light beyond all doubt the destructive effects of machinery and the division of labor, the concentration of capital and real estate, overproduction, crises, the inevitable disappearance of the petty bourgeoisie and peasants, the misery of the proletariat, the anarchy prevailing in production, the irritating inequalities that cry out in the distribution of wealth, the destructive industrial war of some nations against others, the dissolution of ancient customs, of the traditional family, of old nationalities. But as far as its positive formulas are concerned, this socialism has no other aim than to restore the old means of production and exchange, and with them the traditional system of property and traditional society. If it does not intend to force the modern means of production and exchange back into the framework of the system of property which they created and were forced to destroy. In both cases, it is guilty of being both reactionary and utopian. In manufacturing, the restoration of the old guilds, and in the countryside, the establishment of a patriarchal regime. These are their two great aspirations. Today, this socialist movement has fallen into a cowardly slumber. See German socialism or true socialism. The socialist and communist literature of France, born under the pressure of a ruling bourgeoisie and a literary expression of the struggle waged against its subjugation, was imported into Germany at the very moment when the bourgeoisie was beginning to shake off the yoke of feudal absolutism. The philosophers, pseudo-philosophers, and great minds of the country greedily assimilated this literature, but they forgot that the doctrines had not crossed the border with the social conditions to which they responded. When confronted with the German situation, French socialist literature lost all its direct practical significance, assumed a purely literary physiognomy, and became an idle speculation about the human spirit and its projections on reality. And so, while the postulates of the First French Revolution were, for the German philosophers of the 18th century, the postulates of practical reason in general, the aspirations of the revolutionary French bourgeoisie represented in their eyes the laws of pure will, of ideal will, of a truly human will. The only concern of the German writers was to harmonize the new French ideas with their old philosophical consciousness, or, better said, to assimilate those ideas from their philosophical point of view. This assimilation was carried out by the same procedure as one assimilates a foreign language, by translating it. Everyone knows that medieval monks used to fill the manuscripts containing the classical works of paganism with all sorts of meaningless stories about the saints of the Catholic Church. German writers did the opposite with secular French literature. They just added their philosophical absurdities to the French originals. And so, where the original developed a critique of money, they added expropriation of the human being. Where the bourgeois state was criticized, they added abolition of the rule of the abstract general, and so on. This interpolation of philosophical phrases and gibberish in French doctrines was baptized with the names of philosophy of fact, true socialism, German science of socialism, philosophical foundation of socialism, and others like them. Thus, French socialist and communist literature lost all its virility. And since, in the hands of the Germans, it no longer expressed the struggle of one class against another, the German professor deluded himself of having overcome French one-sidedness. In the absence of real needs, he preached the need for truth. And in the absence of the interests of the proletariat, he upheld the interests of the human being, of man in general, of that man who does not recognize classes, who has ceased to live in reality, and has transported himself to the vaporous heaven of philosophical fantasy. But this German socialism, which took its feeble school exercises so seriously, and which trumpeted so much and so solemnly, gradually lost its pedantic innocence. In the struggle of the German, and especially of the Prussian, bourgeoisie against the feudal system and the absolute monarchy, the liberal movement assumed a more serious character. This gave genuine socialism the much-desired opportunity to oppose the political movement with socialist demands, to fulminate against liberalism, against the representative state, against free bourgeois competition, against the freedom of the press, against bourgeois liberty, equality, and rights, preaching to the masses of the people that they would gain nothing and lose much from this bourgeois movement. German socialism was careful to forget that the French criticism, of which it was only a lifeless echo, presupposed the existence of modern bourgeois society with its peculiar material conditions of life and its adequate political organization, both of which were the prerequisites around which the struggle in Germany revolved. This true socialism suited the German absolute governments perfectly, with their whole cohort of clergy, schoolmasters, shabby noblemen, and pen pushers, for it served as a scarecrow against the menacing bourgeoisie. It was a kind of honeyed complement to the ferocious lashes and rifle bullets with which these governments greeted the workers' uprisings. But true socialism, as we see, was not only a weapon in the hands of governments against the German bourgeoisie, but also directly embodied a reactionary interest, the interest of the lower bourgeoisie of the country. The petty bourgeoisie, inherited from the 16th century, and which had not ceased to emerge since then in various forms and modalities, constitutes in Germany the true social basis of the existing order. To preserve this class is to preserve the existing social order. The bourgeoisie fears certain ruin from the industrial and political dominance of the bourgeoisie, both because of the concentration of capital that this means, and because it entails the formation of a revolutionary proletariat. True socialism came to cut off the two wings of this danger with one snip, so she imagined it, and so it spread throughout the country like a veritable epidemic. The pompous clothing in which the German socialists wrapped the handful of bones of their eternal truths, a clothing woven with speculative threads, embroidered with the rhetorical flowers of their wit, soaked in melancholic and romantic mists, made the merchandise even more palatable for that public. For its part, German socialism increasingly understood that its mission was to be the high representative and standard bearer of this lower bourgeoisie. It proclaimed the German nation to be the model nation, and the German subject to be the exemplary type of man. It gave all his servility and vileness a deep and hidden socialist meaning, making them the opposite of what they really were. By curiously rising against the barbaric and destructive tendencies of communism, emphasizing as a contrast the sublime impartiality of his own doctrines, which are alien to all class struggle, he was only drawing the ultimate logical conclusion of his system. All the so-called socialist and communist literature circulating in Germany, with very few exceptions, professes these disgusting and emasculated doctrines. 2. Bourgeois or conservative socialism. A part of the bourgeoisie wishes to mitigate social injustices in order to guarantee the survival of bourgeois society. This group includes economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, those who aspire to improve the situation of the working classes, organizers of charity events, animal protection societies, promoters of campaigns against alcoholism, preachers and social reformers of all kinds. But, in addition, true doctrinal systems have emerged from this bourgeois socialism. An example of this is Proudhon's philosophy of poverty. The socialist bourgeois would consider the conditions of life of modern society to be ideal without the struggles and dangers that they entail. Their ideal is the existing society, purged of the elements that corrode and revolutionize it. The bourgeoisie without the proletariat. It is natural for the bourgeoisie to imagine the world in which it rules as the best of all possible worlds. Bourgeois socialism elevates this comforting idea to a system or semi-system. By inviting the proletariat to realize this by taking possession of the New Jerusalem, what it really demands of it is that it should come to terms forever with the present system of society, but banish the deplorable idea that it forms of it. A second, less systematic and far more practical form of socialism aims at frightening the working class away from any revolutionary movement by making it see that what it is interested in is not any particular political change, but simply certain improvements in the material and economic conditions of its life. Of course, this socialism is careful not to include among the changes affecting the material conditions of life the abolition of the bourgeois mode of production, which can only be achieved by the revolutionary way. Its aspirations are limited to those administrative reforms which are compatible with the present mode of production, and which, therefore, do not affect the relations between capital and wage labor at all, serving only, at best, to reduce the costs of the bourgeoisie's reign and to improve its budget. This bourgeois socialism which we are referring to finds adequate expression only where it becomes a mere figure of speech. We demand free trade in the interests of the working class. We demand protective tariffs in the interests of the working class. We demand cell jail prisons in the interests of the working class. We have at last found the highest and only serious aspiration of bourgeois socialism. All bourgeois socialism is, in fact, reduced to one thesis. The bourgeois are and must remain so, in the interest of the working class. 3. Socialism and critical utopian communism. We do not wish to refer here to the doctrines that in all the great modern revolutions embrace the aspirations of the proletariat, works of Babeuf, etc. The first attempts of the proletariat to directly pursue its class interests in the period of general upheaval, in the period of the collapse of feudal society, were bound to come up against the lack of development of the proletariat itself, on the one hand, and the absence of the material conditions indispensable for its emancipation, which were to be the fruit of the bourgeois epoch, on the other. The revolutionary literature which guided these first hesitant steps of the proletariat is, and necessarily had to be, judged by its content, reactionary. These doctrines profess a universal asceticism and a clumsy and vague egalitarianism. The genuine socialist and communist systems, the systems of Saint-Simon, Fourier, Owen, etc., emerge in the first embryonic phase of the struggles between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, as outlined above. See the chapter, Bourgeois and Proletarians. It is true that the authors of these systems have already penetrated into the antagonism of classes and the action of the dissolving elements that germinate within the ruling society itself. But they have not yet succeeded in seeing in the proletariat an independent historical action, a political movement of its own and peculiar to it. Since class antagonism always develops in parallel with industry, they find themselves lacking the material conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat, and they vainly strive to create them by means of a social science and by dint of social laws. These authors wish to replace social action by their own speculative action, the historical conditions which will determine the emancipation of the proletariat by fantastic conditions of their own making. gradual organization of the proletariat as a class by an organization of society invented according to their whim. For them, the universal course of future history is determined by the propaganda and practical execution of their social plans. It is true that in these plans they are conscious of defending primarily the interests of the working class, but only because they consider it the most suffering class. It is the only function in which the proletariat exists for them. The embryonic form of the class struggle and the conditions in which these authors live make them consider themselves outside the class struggle and as being on a much higher plane. They aspire to improve the living conditions of all individuals in society, even the better off. Hence, they do not cease to appeal to the whole of society without distinction, and they do not address themselves with preference to the ruling class itself. They are certain that it is enough to know their system in order to accept it as the most perfect plan for the best possible society. For this reason, they reject all political action, and especially revolutionary action. They want to achieve their aspirations through peaceful means and try to pave the way for the new social gospel by preaching by example, through small experiments that, naturally, always fail. These fantastic descriptions of the society of tomorrow spring forth at a time when the proletariat has not yet reached maturity. It is therefore still forming a series of fantastic ideas about its destiny and position, carried away by the first, purely intuitive impulses to radically transform society. Yet there is already a principle of criticism in these socialist and communist works, since they attack the very foundations of existing society. They have therefore made a considerable contribution to enlightening the consciousness of the working class. But apart from this, their positive doctrines about the future society, such as those which preach, for example, that the differences between town and country will be abolished in it, or those which proclaim the abolition of the family, of private property, of wage labor, the triumph of social harmony, the transformation of the state into a mere administrative body of production, all revolve around the disappearance of the class struggle, of that class struggle which is beginning to take shape, and which they hardly know in its first, formless vagueness. Therefore, all their doctrines and aspirations have a purely utopian character. The importance of this critical utopian socialism and communism is inversely proportional to the historical development of society. As the class struggle becomes more defined and more pronounced, this fantastic position of superiority over it, this fantastic belief in its suppression, loses practical importance and theoretical meaning. Therefore, although some of the authors of these socialist systems were in many respects true revolutionaries, their disciples today form unquestionably reactionary sects, which wave and imperturbably maintain the old ideas of their masters in the face of the new historical paths of the proletariat. They are, therefore, consistent when they strive to mitigate the class struggle and to reconcile the irreconcilable. And they continue to dream of founding phalansteries, of internal colonization, of creating a little Icaria, a miniature version of the New Jerusalem. And in order to build all these castles in the air, they have no choice but to appeal to the philanthropic generosity of the hearts and pockets of the bourgeoisie. Little by little, they are slipping into the category of reactionary or conservative socialists, from whom they are distinguished only by their systematic pedantry, by the superstitious fanaticism with which they share the miracles of their social science. This is why they are furiously opposed to all the political movements to which the proletariat, blind enough not to believe in the new gospel that they preach, is committed. In England, the Owenites rise up against the Chartists, and in France, the Reformers face the disciples of Fourier. 4. Attitude of the Communists towards other opposition parties. After what we have said in Chapter 2, it is easy to understand the relationship that the Communists have with the other existing workers' parties, with the English Chartists, and with the agrarian reformers of North America. The Communists, while always fighting to achieve immediate objectives and defend the everyday interests of the working class, at the same time represent within the present movement its future. In France, they ally themselves with the Democratic Socialist Party against the conservative and radical bourgeoisie, but without renouncing their right to criticize the clichés and illusions derived from the revolutionary tradition. In Switzerland, they support the radicals, without ignoring the fact that this party is a mixture of contradictory elements: socialist democrats in the French style and radical bourgeoisie. In Poland, the communists support the party which advocates the agrarian revolution as a precondition for the national emancipation of the country, the party which provoked the Krakow insurrection in 1846. In Germany, the Communist Party will fight alongside the bourgeoisie, as long as it acts in a revolutionary manner, fighting with it against the absolute monarchy, the large feudal estates, and the petty bourgeoisie. But all this without neglecting for a single moment to work among the workers, until they have established in them as clearly as possible the consciousness of the hostile antagonism which separates the bourgeoisie from the proletariat, so that when the time comes, the German workers will be ready to turn against the bourgeoisie as so many weapons, those very political and social conditions which the bourgeoisie, once victorious, will have no choice but to introduce. So that the moment the reactionary classes are overthrown, the struggle against the bourgeoisie will automatically begin. The eyes of the communists converge with a special interest on Germany, because they are not unaware that this country is on the eve of a bourgeois revolution, and that this revolutionary upheaval will develop under the favorable conditions of European civilization, and with a proletariat much more powerful than that of England in the 17th century, and that of France in the 18th century, all reasons for which the impending bourgeois German revolution is nothing more than the immediate prelude to a proletarian revolution. In short, communists everywhere support, as we see, all revolutionary movements against the prevailing social and political order. In all these movements, the property system, whatever its more or less progressive form, is emphasized as the fundamental question at stake. Finally, communists work to bring about the unity and understanding of the democratic parties of all countries. Communists need not keep their ideas and intentions secret. They openly declare that their aims can be achieved only by the violent overthrow of the entire existing social order. Let the ruling classes tremble at the prospect of a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose from it but their chains. They have, on the other hand, a whole world to gain. Proletarians of all countries, unite! Watch more videos on our Planeta Libro channel.